A gente está... Boa tarde,
Relaxa.
pessoal. Estamos começando mais uma live Insulae. Hoje a gente está com a professora Nahir Otaño Gracia. Ela é professora assistente da Universidade do Novo México. Ela trabalha com... Vocês estão me ouvindo?
Sim, Isa.
Ela é professora assistente da Universidade do Novo México. Ela está interessada em panoramas teóricos como estudos de tradução e as categorias de identidade, e ela trabalha mais frequentemente com a categoria do Norte Global Atlântico. A gente gostaria de dar as boas-vindas para ela e a gente vai começar com as nossas perguntas. E vocês também podem fazer perguntas no chat. So, I would like to thank Professor Gracia for being here with us today. During this afternoon, I would like to thank her for her time. In the name of all the Insulae group. It is important for us to connect with scholars from different perspectives and places in the world, and to make medieval studies a less centralized field of study and more diverse, which is important. I would like to begin by congratulating her on the very important work she's developing, not only in the field of Arthurian studies, but also in medieval studies as a larger field, as we were discussing just before entering live. It is clear that your work is politically engaged, which is important for us, and it is important to have medievalists thinking beyond our Eurocentric paradigms and epistemologies. So I would like to begin our conversation by asking you to tell us a little bit more about how you first came into Arthurian studies and how was the process of analyzing the sources from a peripheral perspective. And in doing so, what are the theoretical frameworks that you mobilize in your current research?
So I got to the topic actually as an undergrad student. I was, as part of my bachelor's degree at the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras, I had to take courses on medieval literature. So I took that course with Professor Paul Hill, Marian Paul Hill, who was the new hire at the university. She was hired that year to teach medieval literature. So I took her class. I actually had to take an introductory course on Puerto Rican literature that I hadn't taken. It was a course that everybody has to take, and I just took my time taking it. And I took a course on Arthurian literature in the English department. So I sort of had these three kind of very different classes, and they really connected to me. I read these Puerto Rican texts called Póstumo el Envirginado, in which there is an Arthurian character. And the reason why I could see that there was an Arthurian character is because I was taking these medieval course and this Arthurian course. And I just felt such excitement at this. And I felt such excitement in this course on medieval literature. Like it called to me. And the Arthurian text called to me also because my own father and my own grandfather would tell me stories about Arthur. So I saw all these connections that I never heard anybody talking about, and I wanted to explore them. And so when I went to grad school, I was really lucky that the department that I was in basically let me do what I wanted and said, yeah, okay, you want to now study medieval literature? Okay, go ahead, make it happen. And so that's how the interest in sort of understanding why Arthurian lit does thrive in peripheral spaces kind of began. My methodologies, I began with a more translation approach as a methodology. As a grad student, and when I was a grad student, we really couldn't talk about race in the Middle Ages. And so it was not something even I knew to do. So I wanted to show how translations and translation practice in these peripheral Arthurian texts, we're talking about power and we're talking about difference. because that it was something that I could do as a medievalist. And so that's how my work started, and the approaches that I started with. And once these, there's a new, I think, revolution and evolution in medieval studies in which we are more openly talking about power and how power works. And because of that, then I have been able to say and to explain much more openly that what I see in this text is a construction of whiteness, and whiteness as a form that is, it's humanizing. The knights are humanizing themselves at the expense of their enemies and other characters. And so how does that humanization works? How does the knights uh, make themselves in a way lovable so that you excuse their very violent actions? And so that's the work that I'm trying to do right now.
Thanks for your answer, Professor. The next question is particularly interesting for me because, as a fellow interested in Christian narratives, uh, you mentioned in Tristan Oak's old paper that dissemination of Arthurian texts was not linear, but rather like a web following the interconnections between Europe and the Islamic world. So we believe this is a very true regarding, for example, the integrating relationship between Arthurian narratives within the Anglo-Norman War as the role of the Plantagenets playing during the Crusades. So our question now, would you highlight these interactions worth mentioning?
Of course. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I would like to show you an image. Uh, okay. Do you see the screen now?
Yes.
Or you see the map?
Yes, we're sharing right now.
Okay, I'm going to. All right, the map that you see here, what you're seeing is little small red dots, right? And then big dots in red, yellow, green, and blue. So those small red dots that you see are different ways to get to the Caminos de Santiago de Compostela. So different ways that you can get to Santiago de Compostela as a pilgrimage route, right? And Santiago de Compostela was an incredibly important pilgrimage destination right in the Middle Ages. I think at some point up to 500,000 people a year did these walks, right? And they started from different places. So for example, you could start at Porto, right? If you came from the sea, you started at Porto, and then you went your way up. You could start in France. Um, so the Camino de Compostela is this really important destination in the Middle Ages. Now, the dots that you see in red, yellow, green, and blue, those are places in which we found um, documents with Arthurian names. So this is people who named their children after Arthurian characters. The earliest version we have of this happened, actually, it's contemporary with the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. I'm going to stop sharing now. So the what that means is somebody in Spain, named their child after a character from the Historia Regum Britanniae, right, which we consider the catalyst of Arthuriana, at the same time as this text was being written. So when we talk about the movement and interaction of Arthurian texts and Arthurian stories, these stories were happening all over, and they were happening constantly, not just in England. So this is just one example of the ways that movement is happening, right? People walking through these routes and are carrying these stories. Similarly, La Catedral de Compostela has an image of an ailing Tristan, which is contemporary with the French romances. So these stories were circulating be, beyond what we have evidence of, right? And so we have to be really creative on how we show that evidence. Um, again, the Tristan stories, their narratives, the way that they move, we do not know, for example, which versions came first. Did the Italian version came first, or the Catalan, or the Portuguese, or the Castilian? They kind of came at. It's not that they came at the same time. It's that they were being influenced by each other. So they show that how the Mediterranean was interconnected more than they show a clear pattern of first came from one place, then from another, and then from another. They show that it was sort of happening at the same time, and it's more complicated than just going from one place to another. And so that's part of what I want to show, is that these stories traveled with people. And here's another example of that. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is how I understand the movement of Arthuriana in Europe, right? Uh, this is how we usually imagine it, right? The movement of Arthurian text went from England to France, and from France to the rest of Europe. That's how we usually imagine it. But this is what my evidence and my work has shown, is that the movement is much more complicated. And when I created this map, and I created this map years ago, I remember showing it to a colleague, and she pointed out that my map reminded her of actually the spice routes. And so when you look at maps of the spice routes, is also very similar. So these stories were moving when people were moving. And that's what we have to keep in mind. These stories were not just written down, they were also orally shared. And we have to be really creative in showing that and remembering that as we analyze the text. So I hope this helped a little bit.
Yes, I
Oh,
love
of
your
course, yes,
answer,
yes.
and I love that you are thinking about pilgrimage practices, because I think we tend to see narratives and stories as not so much material as other stuff like spices, for example. But yet, narratives do have a materiality, and they do have like they circulate with people. And I think it is interesting to look at pilgrimage practice, because um, pilgrimage also travels with people who are not just elite. And in Arthurian texts, we tend to see uh, Arthurian narratives as a court thing, and like it grows in courtly environments. But by looking at pilgrimage practices, I think we can reach other topographies, maybe.
Yeah.
So we are passing on to our third question. We believe it's very interesting how you construct the idea of Arthurian texts being used to resist subordination in European peripheries, such as Wales and Iceland. You mentioned that on your paper about Tristan og Isolde. At the same time, those same peripheries express through the lexicon of the texts, as you mentioned earlier, a willingness to participate in the destruction in the other through chivalric and feudal ideologies. So we would like to ask you, how, in your opinion, should one approach new paradigms such as border culture and connected histories to analyze these peripheries with these issues in mind?
I think this is a really important question, and I'm really thankful that you are asking it. Uh, so I think two very important things. One is that I think that the genre of Arthurian literature in itself is a genre that it invites understandings of whiteness, right? It's a genre that is constructing the knights as white, right? So when you have texts in Wales and Iceland, places that they're being themselves colonized, right? there the text will be arguing for their humanization through whiteness, because that is part of what the genre of Arthurian romance does. But there are other genres that are doing different things. So, for example, when you look at Old Norse Icelandic literature and you look at the family sagas, they're doing something very different, and they're asking for different things. And so that's also really important to understand that depending on what text you look at, you're going to be looking at something different, right? And so that for me, as a Puerto Rican and Latin American and Caribbean, when I first read the family sagas, it made me think a lot of Gabriel Marcez, Cien Años de Soledad, because these are sagas about families. And so I often thought about the silences in the stories and what they're trying to say about their lives. What does those silences say? And so that I was able to do and think about in that way because of my own understanding of literature, coming as to it as a Puerto Rican Caribbean woman. Um, and so I think that's an important first step, is to think about what are the texts that we're looking at, what are the genres that we're looking at, and what do they do, right? And so Arthurian literature is very much, these are texts that are about expansion. And so yes, the borders are incredibly important, and how they construct the borders is incredibly important. So I think that paying careful attention to that, to the ways that these texts think of borders and border crossings, will tell us a lot about what these texts are doing, because they, I think, depending where they come from, they define the borders differently. So Arthurian texts from written in Catalan and Castilian, they see the borders as the center. They because they are the borders, and they are expanding the borders, and they were historically actually expanding the borders by taking over Al-Andalus. Their understanding of the borders is very different than, for example, England, where to go to these sort of borders, you have to go away, right? The Crusades were happening over there, while in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, the Crusades were happening right here. And so the borders and how you understand the borders are, I think, are critical to be able to do an analysis of Arthurian texts. We must often think about that, and how are these texts understanding the borders and where these borders are. So I hope that question helps. Answer.
Yes, a lot.
It is very
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah, I love your approach. I think it's very.
Moving on to the next question and relating with the previous, it is notable in your work the use of the North Atlantic category. How this category can be used to analyze Arthurian texts, and what of kind of sources can we approach through this point of view? Remember that global history is a new field of research that is very common to how to apply these categories of North Atlantic global history to the Arthurian fields and medieval studies in broader sense. So how this category of North Atlantic can be used to analyze Arthurian texts, and what kind of sources can we approach through this perspective?
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen again very quickly. Okay, so you can see here a map, right? This is a Google Geo, I believe, and it's a map of the North Atlantic Ocean. So if you can, what you can see is that the North Atlantic covers a lot of space. So that's why I call it the global North Atlantic. So when we think of North Atlantic studies, it usually tends to imagine that includes, maybe Scandinavia, England, Ireland, right, Iceland, and so the very top of the North Atlantic. But that's not what the North Atlantic covers. It covers, it covers those spaces, but also the Caribbean, Latin America, the north of Africa. So what I want is for us to think of other ways of organizing the material. in this sense, like I said, I started learning medieval literature thanks to Marian Polhill. So one of the things that she shows in her own work, working with Old Norse Icelandic and Germanic literature, and like Caribbean, Latin American literature, is that there are other models of organization, right? So the global North Atlantic is the one that I use. Other ones, what if we follow whales, which is what one of the examples that Marian Polhill shows. What if we follow whales and their movements, where they actually breed in North Africa and the Caribbean, and then they move up north to Iceland? What would our research look like if we organized it differently, if we followed different models? And so that's what the global North Atlantic does for me. It's asking me to organize my material through a different model, a model that remembers uh, that things work both in local and more expansive ways, and that when we say when we allow for I'm sorry to say, other scholars to define the North Atlantic as just one very specific area, when the North Atlantic is so much more, then we're doing erasure, we're erasing something else. And so what I want is that I want us to focus on what gets erased from conversations and our understandings, and what we don't pay attention to. Because once you use a North Atlantic model, a global North Atlantic model, and you look at texts from, Iceland, Wales, Ireland, Castile, written in Castilian, written in Catalan, texts from Italy, what you see is that these different cultures very much saw themselves as both local and belonging to something bigger. And it usually included the Iberian Peninsula, it included Africa, especially the north of Africa. So places such as Tunis get mentioned constantly. The Strait of Gibraltar gets mentioned constantly. So we need to, I think part of what I want us is, if we organize our work differently, then we will get different answers, and answers that will help us understand what we study better. And I think that here, us coming from Latin America, coming from the Caribbean, we have a different perspective that will make this text we study more valuable. What we have to say right now is of such value because we are coming from that different perspective, a different form of organization. And I think that's really important, that our expertise as scholars is absolutely needed right now to move our field forward.
Thank you for your answer. Very interesting. I would like to ask you something that is not in our script, if that's okay. But I would like to ask you to comment a little bit more how we can use these categories from Latin America, and like being researchers with this point of views. You mentioned Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is an author that I love, and how we can connect with these things from our perspective. And if you have any clever insights.
Yeah, so actually there's I wouldn't say a lot of work, but we're starting to do some of this work. What does it mean to look at medieval literature from different points of views, right? So what does it mean to think about insularity, right? And global insularities, which is very much what the Caribbean is in many ways. It's a global insular space, um, to understand the Middle Ages, right? And that's where my work comes. I rely on Caribbean and indigenous models to understand these, where stories or narratives don't have to be in a straight line, A, B, C, right? So that's what Gabriel Garcia Marquez teaches you, right? That's what El Reino de este Mundo teaches you. Magical realism is a different form of organization that does not tell you a story in a straight manner, right? And what that means is it gives us a different way of analyzing text, because we're not going to be looking necessarily that a story is straight, but what the story is saying as a whole, and in parts, right? And so that gives us a different model than in itself, right? Another way is, so what happens when we study the, if we're going to be true and say we want the Middle Ages to be global, so what happens when we study, when we compare, right? What's happening in Latin America with what's happening in the European Middle Ages in Africa. Like, they are, if we think about how nature shapes us, then that's going to be a different form of organization. So what happens when a volcano explodes, right? And how does that change the way that we tell stories? And how did it change it in, in Africa? How did it change it in Europe? How did it change it in Latin America? Uh, so there are other ways to do comparison, right? And I'm not saying that that means that you have to say, oh, there was contact necessarily, but why is it that sometimes similar ideas pop up in different places, right? Why are there tactics that we come back to over and over again? Well, because they work. So why do they work? And what do we learn about the ways that they work when we look at how they work in one place versus how they work in a different place? So that's the kinds of things that I'm talking about, is that we always want to focus on, was there contact versus contact doesn't have to be just humans contacting each other. Contact can be also about we still live in the same world. And so I think that what that means for our research is, paying attention to what the text says, but that we don't want it. We don't, what's hidden inside the text, right? What are the layers of the text, and what are those layers saying? Because you can read with the text. The text is telling you one thing, but you can also read against the text, and that tells you a different story. So what happens when you read the text not following the linear story that we're supposed to follow, but by thinking the text through a model that follows Gabriel Garcia's Marquez logic that we've learned through reading Cien Años de Soledad, you're going to get to a different place. So it's like we can apply different methodologies to these texts because they're going to tell us a different story. And that story is just as valid as the stories we already talk about these texts. And when I say stories, I mean, I mean historia y historia, ¿no? Esto es un cuento, esto es una historia, is both, right?
Yes.
My expertise makes my analysis incredibly valid because I have, I'm not going to say exactly how many years, but lots and lots of years of doing research, right? And I am an expert in these languages. I can read these languages in the original. And that expertise, the analysis I am doing comes with that expertise, but it also comes with a different methodology. And that is what I want us to be able to say. My expertise, your expertise is important because it comes with the expertise and with a different methodology. And that combination is very powerful. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I like that you mentioned reading against the text. I remember Walter Benjamin's suggestions for us historians to read against the grain and read against the texts. And I think Arthurian literature and Arthuriana, it is an amazing material for us to do that, because in many ways, Arthurian literature and Arthurian matter is the matrix of how we tell stories in the West, and one of the matrices, at least. And I think for us as Latin Americans, again, it is important for us to look at these texts and see connections and see what we have here and what they have there, and see these connections.
And we keep reproducing it, right?
Yes.
Somehow it works because we keep reproducing it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So,
and like when I began my research, I had a question that it was a very clear question, and it was a somewhat childish question, but I would like to know back then, why did I have this image, and it was such a clear image for me, of Arthur's death. Like he's sailing away and to be carried away to Avalon and to an island. And that was my question to begin. Like, why in Latin America, as a woman here living in Brazil, I had this such a clear image of a story that was written 1,000 years ago. And I think it is nice for us to have this kind of questions because we grow up with these stories and they are ingrained here. Anyway, I drifted away
Yeah, brother.
a little
Oh,
bit.
Yeah,
but
brother.
that's right, right? I grew. My father used to tell me about how Lancelot could defeat everybody because he was the best knight. Um, I had no idea that that was medieval. that was
Yes.
that my father was telling me a medieval story. He was just telling me a story that it was exciting to him. I went to school. I went to do my bachelor's, and then I read Chrétien de Troyes, materials, The Night of the Lion, and I was like, oh my god, this is what my dad was talking to me about. These are the stories, and I remember really disliking Yvain as a character, but really loving the text, and I feel like that is how I got into it. I find the stories fascinating and I find the characters, I don't like them at all, but I know I'm supposed to like them. And so that's part of what got me really excited. But also seeing that there are Puerto Rican texts that were drawing from this. So why is it that a 19th century Puerto Rican writer saw value in using Arthur to tell a story? You know,
Yes,
and
it's the same in Brazil. We have Literatura de Cordel, which is like this texts that circulate in the northeast of Brazil, and they are using like during the 19th century, during the 20th century, they are using Gawain as a character.
oh
Character,
wow,
it's so cool to like pick up these little
Here
things.
in a brother sense, we have a central bounding question that is why here in Brazil we have and these texts cause such an species of uh, static pleasure that make us dream, imagine, and think about love, death, war,
Which
and
are universal experiences. And I think I don't know, I like to use the category of myths to analyze Arthurian texts. And I think myths can be seen as like transmitting universal experiences. And I think we can really see that in Arthurian texts.
I think
yeah,
somehow these texts and narratives dialogue with us in a various multiple ways that allow us to study, to analyze, to criticize, and to make us feel alive
hmm,
somehow. So it's a
yeah,
very interesting mode of analyze and read these texts against the texts and making the analysis between the very layers, as the
yeah.
professor has said.
Well, and that's part of what I say. I think that what Arthurian texts do really well is the main it's humanized the main characters, right? They are, like I said, they are tactics that work, right? And the tactics of these texts is they make you fall in love with the characters. They're written in such a way that you fall in love with these characters so that you see their humanity at the expense of everybody else's humanity, right? Like you can forgive them anything because they're such great characters, right? And that's what I think. For example, for me, that's part of what I found really compelling. I find these characters and these stories really compelling, but I wish and what I realize is part of the reason why they're so compelling is because they want you to cheer for these characters when they ultimately end up doing things that we should not cheer for, right? So that you forgive them when they do things that end up being, if you actually are able to distance yourself enough, are actually pretty horrible. I often think about the movie The Hunger Games. You remember that movie, the first one, where
Yes.
at the
Yes.
end, the at the end, we have one of the sort of one of the other players make this talk about how they're not human and people just want to see them die and they're in a TV show, and then he kind of falls and gets. I know he gets in the book or the movie one he gets eaten, right, but he dies, right. And I remember there were people that clapped at the movie theater when he dies, like, oh, and I was like, but that's not the point. Is is this is a victim as much as she is, right? Like, he's an awful person, but you aren't seeing him as human. You're literally celebrating that he's dying, and on a TV show in which everybody is dying because they forced them in there, right? And so I always found that moment really difficult for me. Like, that's that's what some of these stories do. They humanize some characters at the expense of the other characters, and that does not mean that these characters are good or bad. Is that, do I ultimately believe that anybody deserves to die in a video game? No. All of their deaths are horrible. I don't think anybody should die like that, right? But it makes you forget that, because what you're thinking is about these other character that you fall in love with as a character. And so I remember that being a really good example in the modern times. And I think that Arthurian literature do these. They The narrative makes you fall in love with its own narrative and the characters, so that you forget and forgive all the damage that they do. That it's mentioned, but it's so subtle. Sometimes it's like, Tiran lo Blanc, which is a Catalan text. He just says, yeah, and then they went back in boat, and they ransacked all of the north of Africa and the coast of Spain, because at that time it was Al Andalus, and it was Muslim. It was Muslim territory. So yeah, so it's okay that they just destroyed all these area because it was ruled by Muslims, right? And the text just tells you this, and it makes it normalize it. But this is on page 150, because before all of that, the text makes you fall in love with this character so that you see this as the thing that he's supposed to do. And so that's what I want to point out, is how these texts convince us of the righteousness of these characters.
Yes. And looking at another, right, like the Muslims. Wow, let's go back to our script.
Sorry.
No, it is. I have to apologize. I drifted away.
We have to
Wow.
make this little detour.
I'm having
Yeah.
fun. This is great.
Real.
Well, we're heading to our last question. We would like to ask you about the centrality of the category of the race in recent studies within the medieval studies, which is a very pungent question. And more specifically, dear to Diana, the works of medievalists of color, such as Geraldine Hang, Richard Severe, and Cord J. Whittaker, Dorothy Keane, and of course the professor herself, um, made a valuable contribution to the ongoing process of demystification and even decolonization of a traditionally white and Eurocentric area of studies. How do you see the advances, and what would you say to the young researchers, such as ourselves, who are increasingly concerned about social justice, gender equality, and political commitment in their research?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's a hard question. I would say, you gotta do, you gotta live with yourself, right? And so I personally could not live with myself if I didn't do the things that if I didn't do things in a way that was true to who I am as a person. And so that's part of it. It's more work doing, discussing race, trying to understand how it works, going against the text and against the grain. It always takes more work, but has made the work more valuable for me to do it that way. I think that for me as a Puerto Rican and thinking about race in Latin America, I think that it's absolutely important to understand the Middle Ages, especially how race was codified in the Iberian Peninsula, so that we understand then how those ideas about race were brought to the Americas, right? And how they continue to have an influence in how we understand race in Latin America, in Puerto Rico, and even here in New Mexico. So by understanding like by understanding what the conquistadores brought in their ideas about power and race, helps us understand what we see and don't see about our own ideas about power and race now. And I would say, for example, our ideologies of mestizaje are very much connected to the ideas of convivencia of the Middle Ages in Spain. This idea that somehow we we come from this sort of combination that of people that somehow is gonna mix itself into something different, is coming from the idea of convivencia, which is that Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived somehow peacefully, and of course all these things are coming from something real, but what is missing from that analysis is the power. How does power create differences, and how that power in systems of power are then creating hierarchies, and how they look like, and who are we erasing when we do that? Who are we who are we hurting when we do that? Who are we enacting violence against when we do that? And so I think that more than ever, these new reassessments of race that are happening in the Middle Ages are significant for us that are coming from the global south, that are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, because it very much speaks to our own experiences. It helps us understand and trace our own histories and the histories of violence that come with that, right? And so I think we need to do two things. We need to celebrate the things that we have done, right? And I think that's very important. As I'm Puerto Rican, and that gives me a very, I have a history that follows me. So I think it's very important to celebrate the things that Puerto Rico has done. It's very important to celebrate Bad Bunny, for example, and the really amazing music that he's making, even though it's completely different to something else. It's important to celebrate reggaeton, to celebrate la brega, which is how Puerto Ricans, how we understand. I would say it's one of our philosophies is la brega. So it's important to celebrate the things that makes us thrive and live, and then we also have to be honest and confront our legacies and our legacies of whiteness. And this work on race in the Middle Ages is going to help us do that if we come at it from a point of view of of good faith work, where what we want to do is to better our field and better our communities around us. And I think that those are the very two important things, and what I try to do the most. I want my work to confront the legacies of whiteness and mestizaje in some ways, but I also want to celebrate the really important work that Puerto Ricans and Latin Americans and Brazilians, that we're all doing. And so those things need to happen together, I believe, because we're whole people with many, that we can do many things. We're multifaceted, and so I want that, and I see that as part of my research and part of who I am as a professor and a teacher. So I think that that's the most important thing for me, is that we approach this work from a place of wanting transformation, and to transform our communities and our world into a better place, while we confront our realities and we're honest about what still needs to be done. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you for your answer. Sorry, I was muted. It is very important for us to be thinking about these questions, and those are values that I believe Luan and I are searching in our work and in our researchers. So it is very important for us to be hearing from you today. I believe that's all we had prepared to ask. Luan, would you like to say something?
Firstly, I would like to thank the kindness of Professor Nahir to being here with us to talk about her current interest of research, about these themes who are so deeply connected between us, between our reality, shared reality as Latin Americans, researchers of medieval studies. And the last question is a question of extreme importance for us all, living in times that these themes, these subjects, these matters came up, and we have to deal with this. We have to struggle with this. We have to survive with this. So our reality here in Brazil is deeply engaged in such perspectives of studies, and I think the political temperature here in US is also. So these themes are for such extreme importance to us. So we have once more to thank Professor Nahir for sharing her knowledge, for sharing her patience, for sharing her love and interest to discuss to us young students and for the people who is watching this or who will watch this more later. So Professor, very we are very happy to be here with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I honestly, it's such an honor to be here. I am so excited that I get to talk to you all and that we're doing this. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, anything else. I'm here as best I can.
Thank you so much. I'll be emailing you about the references of Arthurian names contemporary to Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. I, I think it was fascinating, and I want those references.
Oh, I'll send them to you.
Well, I guess that's all for today. Thank you again, Professor Otaño Gracia, and we will see you for the next Insular Live. Thank you.
Pessoal, então a gente está encerrando aqui a nossa live com a professora Nahir. Então, obrigado para todo mundo que esteve aqui presente conosco até o presente momento. Fiquem ligados nas nossas redes sociais, tá bom? Não se esqueçam de curtir o conteúdo, tá? Compartilhar, divulgar nos seus grupos. E aí, a gente espera vocês na próxima live, tá bom? Então, Isa, foi um prazer mais uma vez. Professora, agradeço novamente e a gente se vê no próximo, gente. Tchau, tchau.